Turning now to the mounting pressure across the country against the Liberals' signature climate policy. 7 provinces are now opposing the planned April 1st increase of the carbon tax. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said last month that he won't submit his province's share of the carbon tax from natural gas. Today, saying the tax just brings more uncertainty to the people in his province.
Here's an example of a way to not build certainty, and quite the opposite, to build uncertainty in our investment environment, is to go forward with an unconsulted carbon tax, to stand up and say it is never going to go over $50 a ton. Very quickly come out after that and say, oh, we made a mistake. It's actually going to go to $170 a ton. Then we're going to talk about possibly bringing it to $240 a ton. But that's the only tool that we're going to need in order to achieve what we do.
Okay, so the Liberals are battling an affordability crisis against the climate crisis. How will they respond to this? Adam Van Koeverden is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and he joins me now. Mr. Van Koeverden, thanks for taking the time. Okay, I didn't hear your audio, so I'm hoping we can. I think you might be muted at your end, Mr. Van Koeverden, so I don't want to do all the talking in this conversation, so I hope we can hear you now. I'm going to ask you, there's been a lot of criticism this past week for years about the climate, about the carbon price, but it's coalesced and manifested in a pretty significant way this week. Are you losing the narrative battle here with your opponents on the climate policy?
Well, thanks, David, and it's nice to see you too. Sorry about the hiccup there. I think one thing is abundantly clear that we need to fight climate change just as we need to fight for affordability for Canadians. And it's important to note that the serious governments need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And there's simply no denying the fact that climate change exists and it's human caused. It was only about 6 or 7 months ago when we were in Ottawa and the sky was completely orange. But at the same time, Canadians are struggling and bills are mounting and the cost of living crisis is very, very real. The challenge here is that inflation and the price on pollution are being conflated as the same thing, and they're simply not. There is a price on pollution and a carbon price in the provinces that you listed, and there's also an inflation issue, and thankfully that's abated quite significantly. But I find it ironic from those provinces in particular, because ultimately it's up to the provinces whether or not their constituents pay the federal backstop program. Because in Ontario, for example, we had a cap and trade program. In Manitoba, they had cap and trade. So just like British Columbia and Quebec provinces that used to have their own emissions reductions programs and goals to fight climate change, aren't subject to the federal backstop program. But it's essential that every single province and territory does have a plan to fight climate change. And for the provinces that seem to be against the federal backstop program now, it was their choice to impose it because they're the ones that are denying climate change. I saw Premier Moe there, and I do recall how proud he was of coal power coming to the rescue, which was a false dichotomy that he proposed during the extreme cold alerts in Alberta over the course of some of the coldest days in the winter. But 2 things are true. Canadians are struggling financially, and we need to fight climate change, and serious governments need to be able to have a plan for both, and we do.
Right, but there are premiers who have aggressive climate mitigation and climate change policies, like Dennis King in Prince Edward Island, who was on the show last night. He's not denying climate change, but as a province that's at the end of the supply chains, where life is already more expensive than it is in the larger centres where you can get things at scale. Him, Andrew Furey in Newfoundland and Labrador, they've also written letters asking for it to be paused because they're hearing it and feeling it from their people. So this is not just the premiers you need to convince, it's Canadians who seem to be losing confidence in the idea of carbon pricing.
Well, you're right. And what I'd add is that the provinces are all very proud of the fact that their emissions have gone down over the last 8 years. And that's because, in part, of carbon pricing. Up to a third of the 7% reductions that we've seen in emissions right across this country are attributable to pricing carbon in Canada, whether that's through cap and trade in Quebec, the federal backstop program in most provinces and territories, or British Columbia's carbon tax. Carbon pricing works. It lowers emissions, that fights climate change, and our program takes the largest emitters, the biggest polluters, it makes them pay, and it forces the money back to Canadian families. It puts more money back into the pockets of families, 80% of them. And typically those are the ones that need it most. And I actually read some of the wise words of a Regina-based anti-poverty ministry in Regina. His name's Peter Gilmer. And with respect to the rebates that people will be receiving and receive quarterly and have been for some time now, He said that for the vast majority of low-income people, whether they're on income security programs or earn low wages, they're better off in terms of the bottom line when receiving the rebate and paying the carbon tax. So this false narrative that's being driven by the Conservatives that the price on carbon is causing financial hardship needs to be called out as false. It's a mischaracterization of a climate change mitigation program, a program that's working to reduce our emissions, and it is fighting climate change. Now, the Conservatives also haven't put forward any sort of a plan to fight climate change or reduce emissions in Canada. And it's important to recognize that's part of the deal that we have with future generations. I'm not willing to stand by and let our emissions, continue to go up unabated. I want to be part of the generation that turned it around and ensured that the future is as bright as it has been for us.
Right.
Back in 2015, our emissions in Canada were still going up. They were accelerating, and we've turned that around, and we've seen a reduction since then. And 30% of those reductions are attributable to our price on pollution.
Okay, so how do you, like the economic analysis on the rebate and how it applies to people, the Climate Institute has an analysis on it and backs up what you're saying, that the vast majority of families are better off, and if you scrapped it and scrapped the rebate, only wealthier Canadians would end up with more money in their pocket. So, I mean, the analysis on that is math. But you say 30% of the emissions reductions are attributable to the price on carbon. I understand how it works with industrial emitters and the work you've done, for example, with like the steel makers in places like Hamilton, where you put them onto a cleaner form of energy. You can measure that because it takes an emissions output out of the system. It's harder for anyone to find a clear explanation of how the individual consumer carbon price is driving down emissions. I can't find it on the government page. I believe it was the environmental watchdog. The environmental commissioner said it isn't quantified in any way. How do you know it's working if it's not measured and reported anywhere?
Well, it is measured and reported. Our emissions are measured and reported on an annual basis from all sectors. And the only sector in Canada whose emissions continue to go up is the oil and gas sector, primarily out of Alberta and the oil sands. But Canada's doing a really good job. We're doing a great job lowering our emissions. We're fighting climate change. And we're trying to do something about the fact that Canadians per capita have the highest carbon footprint in the world. We live in a cold country that also gets warm in the summer, so we require heating and cooling. We drive long distances in larger vehicles to get to school and work, and these are realities of Canadian experiences, and we need to confront some of those and recognize that when fossil fuels and burning propane, home heating oil, natural gas, diesel and gasoline are the only solutions to some of our problems like heating our homes or getting to work, then we'll continue to have a very intensive carbon footprint. But that's not something that, when I talk to people here in Milton, that Canadians want for the future of our country. We want alternatives. We want to find innovations in technology. We want to know that when we plug something in the wall, it's not coal-fired power that's charging our cell phones. So, like I said earlier, the rebate program is a really, really significant part of the equation that the Canada Carbon Rebate just doesn't get talked about enough. And for families in Ontario, that's over $1,100 that they're going to receive back this year to account for the levy on fuels. And that's creating an incentive to make better decisions. I actually received an email from somebody that said, we'll talk about how, we all make decisions every day, maybe with respect to our vacations. You can choose to go out on a fishing boat or you can choose to go in a canoe, and going out in a canoe doesn't require any fuel. Right,
and look, I acknowledge that overall emissions are trending down, and in no small part because of the overall climate plan. You can see it in terms of the recorded targets, but what's not broken out is the actual specific amount of emissions reductions that are tied directly to the commercial carbon price. And this is one of to the consumer carbon price. And this is one of the criticisms, that as people pay more, they can't necessarily look at an emissions reduction and say this is the direct effect of this extra cost that individuals are bearing. How do you measure that? How do you measure the effectiveness of it if that's not broken out that way?
Well, we rely on insight from the Environment Commissioner, and we rely on great science. There was a Nobel Prize awarded in economics for carbon pricing not too long ago. When you read about how market-based instruments like a carbon price are effective in macroeconomics, I won't pretend to know everything about how that works, but they can compare economies that have a carbon price to economies that don't. They can compare historical emissions against GDP in environments where there is a carbon price and where there is not. And they can infer the fact that, yeah, a third of our emissions reductions since 2015 are attributable to our price on pollution. And at the same time, we've sent more money back to 80% of families in Canada and driven that incentive to ensure that, burning fossil fuels, burning natural gas isn't the only way to heat your home. And for families who are still stuck on home heating oil, we're providing all sorts of incentives and funding to get them onto a heat pump. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask as a final point. You heard Scott Moe off the top there making his argument against the carbon price. He's not charging the carbon price in violation of federal law. He's not remitting the carbon price in violation of federal law. What's your government going to do about that? Nobody seems to want to give an explicit answer. They seem to be leaving it to the Canada Revenue Agency. Is that what's happening here?
Well, what I'm really concerned about is for lower income people in Saskatchewan. People like Alan Holman. I read an article yesterday who said the carbon rebate he gets 4 times a year from the federal government is crucial for his household budget. And I quote, "It gets plugged in with the rest of my money for whatever's on my list," said Holman in a phone interview. He said, "I'm kind of a little screwed if I don't get that rebate." So I'm concerned that, we already know that Premier Moe isn't terribly interested in fighting climate change. He's certainly not interested in moving away from coal-fired power, as he's bragging about his coal-fired power solution. I remember back in 2005 in Ontario when we were still burning coal to make electricity, and we had 45 smog days that summer in 2005. I remember because I was training for the World Championships, and the air quality was really, really bad. I was training in Oakville between Hamilton and Toronto, and the smog days kept us off the water sometimes. And coal is bad for our health. Coal is bad for the planet, and it's a terrible way to generate electricity. And if premiers like Scott Moe would recognize that it's 2024, we all have a role to play in fighting climate change and reducing our emissions, then Canada's emissions would be a lot lower. But I've never heard climate change or a desire to fight climate change from Premier Moe or frankly from a lot of those conservative premiers that we hear from.
Okay, Adam Van Koeverden, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining me today. That's Adam Van Koeverden, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
David.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. It's time for our daily Power Rankings, our look at who is shining and who is stumbling. I'm joined by Zane Velji, former strategist for the Alberta NDP. Michael Solberg, he was a staffer in the Stephen Harper government. And Shannon Proudfoot, she's with the Globe and Mail. All right, gang, let's get to it with our quote of the day. Today's quote is this: "Those premiers who say we should pause this need to tell us what they are doing and what we should be doing to fight climate change that will achieve the same results at the same cost." Michael, who you got?
Prime Minister Trudeau seems too on the nose. So I'm going to say this is Stephen Guilbeault who said this.
Okay, a very popular man in your neck of the woods. Shannon, who you got?
I'm going to guess Guilbeault as well because I feel like Trudeau would have been more shamey and scoldy about it.
Okay, all right. Zane, who you got?
That is the most measured Guilbeault quote of all time, if it is indeed him. So I'm going with Wilkinson on this one.
Okay, let's play the clip.
Ooh, good point.
So those premier who say we should pause this need to tell us what they're doing and what we should be doing to fight climate change that will achieve the same results at the same cost.
Okay, so unless Jonathan Wilkinson got new glasses and a beard, that was Environment and Climate Change Minister Stephen Guilbeault pushing back against this growing call from premiers to cancel the planned April 1st increase on the carbon tax. A hot topic this week, Michael, it's your pick today, so we're just going to kind of roll right into that because the premiers are writing letters, the premiers are breaking the law, the premiers are saying don't, and it doesn't sound like the Liberals are going to listen.
Yeah, sure. You bet. It's a lot of chaos, and it's a lot of chaos in the Liberals' own making. And yes, there are 7 premiers, but there might be 8 very soon. I think Premier Canoe might throw his hat into this as well. So no question, there's some significant malcontent and some angst between provinces and this government with respect to the carbon tax. And look, it's going up on April 1st. And I think the Liberals are losing this fight. Not only are the premiers across the country has this government drawn their ire, but they're also losing the air war, which I think is really important on this. Other issues of the day have become far more important for Canadians, namely on affordability and the cost of living. Sure, there have been past mandates in past years and past looming elections where environment and climate change have ranked higher, but not so the case right now. Heck, even Alberta NDP leadership candidates are calling for a pause or elimination of the retail carbon price. So, this is a major mess that the Liberals' own making. Had they not carved out home heating oil in the fall for Atlantic provinces, this would not be as big of an issue, but they've undermined their own environmental policy, and they're paying the price for it now.
Right, and again, I have to remind everyone, it's a national carve-out for home heating oil.
I knew you were
Yes,
gonna
I
do
know, the Atlantic provinces pushed for it, but I have to keep saying it because it's true. But, you know, Zane, Michael's right on the political analysis of it, right? But carbon pricing is meant to work over a long horizon. So how do you balance that long-term policy objective and the importance of achieving those targets versus all this short-term political noise and pain?
Well, I think there's two things happening here at once. I think Michael's analysis is correct. I think there's a second part to it, which is that this has become a multi-partisan call out against the carbon tax for a couple of reasons. You got the Pierre Poilievre AXA tax, that's the most obvious. But the second part of it is equally as important. When Joe Biden in the Inflation Reduction Act suggested we don't need carbon pricing to have the most ambitious climate plan that country had ever seen, it now allowed a permission structure for anyone, regardless of their partisan stripe, to say carbon pricing does not have to be the be-all, end-all. Sure, are the experts and economists suggesting it's the most effective way? Yes, that still continues to be the case, but it allows governments that are even sensitive on the climate, even want to be proactive on the climate, to figure out and say this does not have to be the instrument. So when the instrument becomes not very popular, like it is right now, or when it gets bungled in its communications, like it has, it allows this multi-partisan coalition to start forming against Trudeau. And I think it is very important for us to understand that that is one of the fundamental shifts that's happened in the course of the last 24 to 30 months that is allowing this to become an even greater political headache for Justin Trudeau on the political level, as much as it is allowing climate to be addressed without the carbon tax as a policy tool going forward.
Right, and Shannon, like there is no national carbon tax or federal carbon tax in the United States, but a bunch of states have it. Like I think it's about 14, a lot of them in New England, and the big one, California, which is a G7 economy on its own, it has carbon pricing, right? So it does exist at the subnational level, and it could exist in Canada at the subnational level if, like it does in Quebec, if provinces did what they needed to do to avoid having it imposed after they lost at court.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of irony there, isn't there? That if they don't like the national plan that's been imposed on them, they could craft a homegrown one that would presumably serve their residents and voters better. So it's a little bit cute, like this sort of unified pushback. I'm going to be a little bit more cynical about it. I'm actually sort of surprised that the feds haven't answered more forcefully. Okay, premiers, if you don't like this, well, why didn't you come up with your own plan when you had a chance? You could have opted out. I do also think a little bit of perspective is necessary, and in zero way do I want to be glib about cost of living concerns. But when the carbon price goes up on April 1st, it looks to add about 3.3 cents a liter to gas. So if you drive a car with like a 60-liter tank, it's about $2. Like that's not nothing, but it's not like a crippling amount of money. 0.15%, I think, in the order of consumer goods and foods. So just because the heat of this conversation, I feel like exceeds the reality of it, because I would argue it has become a culture war. I do think a little bit of perspective on what it actually will do to people's pocketbooks is necessary. But I don't think at all anyone else is wrong that the Liberals have sort of set themselves up for this. Once they did the heating oil carve out, which yes is national, but nobody really took it that way. I think they both sort of showed weakness and showed a willingness to kind of fold. I mean, the Prime Minister's big quote this week was like, look, I'm not here to be popular, I'm here to get stuff done. But the reality is some of that was a concession to popularity, or to at least the national temperature.
No, and you make a good point. I mean, this is not mortgage renewal, which people are going through in terms of affordability. It is an increased cost in some areas, but there is an increased rebate coming with it. And, this is just the challenge of making people see that and believe it, right? Because this is the conversation. But boy, Zane, Shannon referencing the Prime Minister was a perfect segue for what you wanted to talk about today.
It's like we don't even need a host on the show, David.
You know what? I'll just leave. You guys got to be done by 7. Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
Kidding.
Eastern.
Yeah, please don't leave us in charge. I've got an up and a down, so I've hacked the system, David. I figured it out. It's the exact same thing. It is exactly what Shannon mentioned, which is that Trudeau quote, the paraphrasing of, I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to do the hard things that matter to future generations. It's an up because, oh my God, I am a sucker for for any West Wing-like rhetoric. And was that ever some West Wing-like rhetoric? But it's a down because what? Like, at the end of the day, man, like, that is exactly what this thing is. This thing of governing is about, you know, being responsive, yes, doing the right thing, but maybe not saying the part you're supposed to, you know, keep silent around popularity out in person, or out loud in front of the cameras. The reason I bring it up is I think, to me, it's the clearest sign thus far that Trudeau is in legacy preservation mode. I'm not getting, super sort of like predictive around the future, but to me, this is a voice of a guy that knows it's over, but wants to save a core program. So when this party needs to rebuild after inevitable conservative governments, perhaps plural, that there's at least some value systems there, and he's not willing to cave on it today. To me, that moment actually told me a whole lot around the mindset of this prime minister, that he's here to stay to fight, and he wants to preserve some of the things he's put into place, including this very now unpopular carbon tax.
So let Bartlett be Bartlett, but only to a point, is what you're saying there, Zane.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Until Bartlett loses. Yes,
right.
Exactly.
So Michael, what are your thoughts on that? I know I saw some snark when he said, "I'm not here to be popular," and people are like, "Well, mission accomplished," because, you know, sort of where the polls are right now. But, you know, acknowledging the challenging environment they are in, but also showing defiance that I'm not budging on April 1 and I'm not going anywhere. He's out traveling the country in a way that does not look like a guy who sees the end of his political career anytime soon.
Sure, yeah. I mean, he's trying to put up a fight and to try and, salvage some of his image despite, being very unpopular. But, it reminds me of Dalton McGuinty in 2007, in the mandate that he earned there as Ontario's premier. He used that time to raise taxes, namely through the HST. But because he did an adequate sales job and convinced Ontarians that it was in the public's interest that he pursue and do these things, he was rewarded with another government in 2011. And, that was after some time in government as well. So, Trudeau would be wise to try and consider how to do that as well. The problem is he's been unable to convince the public that anything he is doing is in the public interest, whether it's on housing or the carbon price and their plan to tackle climate change. They're losing on every single front right now. And it just seems like he has a total inability to turn the tide. So yes, he's unpopular, but he's probably going to remain unpopular. And unless he starts winning the air war, which at present he's losing, he will also lose the election.
But Shannon, it was this sort of candid moment from the Prime Minister, though. I'm not here to just be popular, right? I know that's not an exact quote, but it jumped out to me as well, the way it jumped out at Zane. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think there's a slightly different way to look at it. I mean, as you're saying that the snark was sort of there for the taking, like, well, yes, buddy, because that's where you are. So we're glad you're comfortable with it. But a different way to look at it, and I don't actually mean this as cynically and sort of facetiously as it will sound, is right now, the way things are, and a year is a long time in politics, we all know that, it looks like Justin Trudeau and his party are going to go down in a heap in 2025. So then I would sort of adopt, it sounds nihilistic, but I actually mean it more sort of earnestly. I would adopt an idea of, well, then what is going to be your legacy? What are you going to leave behind? It's kind of what Zane is getting at, but I think there's a way to look at the carbon tax and kind of clinging to it with your fingernails as like there is no other furniture to save right now. Like maybe your time to do sort of change-making legislation to kind of push this country in a different direction is over because the milk has soured. This could be, still is maybe a signature policy that he's not wrong that it could have, ramifications for the future. I think that's a really hard political argument to make. And I would argue maybe the biggest failure of the carbon tax has been a communications one. I think it's been sold really poorly and explained to people really poorly. That's not to say that it's like a faultless, blameless policy, but it just hasn't been sold very well. So I think, if you're not in it for the popularity, if you're in it for leaving something behind, this might be it. But that was undercut badly with the heating oil climb down. The only thing I will say is when that happened a few months ago, I was sort of having myself a fun time on various pundit panels like this, kicking them in the shins over and over and saying how sort of cynical and boneheaded it was. And I was on one panel with a colleague from the National Post, Ryan Tumulty, who pointed out that maybe Trudeau sort of made the best of a series of bad choices, which were either climb down on that or go through a whole winter of news stories of a grandma on the East Coast who had to not heat her house. And it made me sort of see it through a different lens, that maybe it was a strategic decision, maybe not the most idealistic one, but not quite as boneheaded as it appeared.
Oh, look, anyone from my neck of the woods has family members who were facing that possible situation. Oil ain't cheap, and those houses aren't necessarily insulated all that well, and it's expensive in some of the lower income parts of Atlantic Canada for sure.